The pilot's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "Sir, you need to step out of that seat, right now." The words landed hard, louder than necessary, sharp enough to make conversations die mid-sentence. The engines were still humming at the gate, a low animal growl vibrating through the floor. Every head in first class turned. Every breath paused. The man in seat 1C did not move. He didn't look startled. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from travel, but the kind that settles in the eyes of someone who has seen the same injustice too many times and already knows how this moment usually ends. Captain Harold Bennett stood in the aisle, shoulders squared, jaw locked. 63 years old, 38 years in uniform. A lifetime of checklists, procedures, and silent authority. His hat was tucked under his arm like a badge of rank. To him, this cabin was sacred ground. Order lived here. Hierarchy lived here. People knew their place, or at least they used to. "Sir," Bennett said again, slower now, as if speaking to a child, "you're not appropriate for this section. We have standards." The man finally looked up. Dark eyes, steady. No rush, no fear. "I bought the seat," he said. His voice was calm, low, controlled. American, Midwestern maybe. "I'm sitting in it." A ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. A woman in pearls shifted in her lie-flat seat. A retired couple near the window exchanged a glance that said this was not how a morning flight was supposed to begin. The air smelled faintly of coffee and leather and something metallic beneath it all, like a storm about to break. Bennett felt his pulse climb. He hated this part, the resistance, the quiet defiance. It always forced him to escalate, and escalation in his mind was proof of leadership. "You're making people uncomfortable," Bennett said, gesturing vaguely behind him without looking. "This is a premium cabin. People pay for an experience, for calm, for a certain environment." The man's hands rested on his knees, long fingers, no rings. His jacket was plain, no logos, no flash. He looked like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That, more than anything, irritated Bennett. "My name is Nathan Cole," the man said, "and I'm not bothering anyone." From the galley, the lead flight attendant watched the scene unfold. Linda Morales, 58 years old, 25 years flying. She knew Bennett's posture, knew that stiffness in his neck meant he had already decided how this would end. She also knew the company memos, the lawsuits, the quiet training videos about bias and de-escalation that most captains clicked through without watching. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "Captain," she said gently, stepping closer. "His ticket is valid. I checked it myself. Full fare." Bennett didn't turn. "Linda, I've got it." His tone was clipped, final, a door closing. She swallowed. "There's no dress code violation." Silence. Heavy. Pressurized. Bennett leaned closer to Nathan, lowering his voice but not his authority. "You don't fit the profile for this cabin," he said, "and I'm not going to let this turn into something bigger than it needs to be." Nathan felt it then, the familiar weight in his chest. Not anger, not surprise. Recognition. The old script playing again. He glanced toward the window, where rain streaked down the glass, distorting the tarmac lights into long, trembling lines. Somewhere outside, a baggage cart beeped as it reversed. Life going on, indifferent. "What profile is that?" Nathan asked. Bennett straightened. "One that doesn't raise questions." Nathan gave a slow nod, as if filing the words away. "I see." In the cockpit, the first officer sat frozen, hands resting on his thighs. Mark Ellison, 47, recently divorced, still paying off his daughter's college loans. He had heard the exchange through the open door, every word drilling into his skull. His instinct screamed that this was wrong. His training told him the captain had final authority. His fear whispered that speaking up had consequences. He stared at the instrument panel, at the familiar glow of dials and screens, and said nothing. Bennett made his decision. He felt it settle in his bones, solid and righteous. "You're going to move to the back," he said. "We have an open seat in Economy Plus. You'll be more comfortable there." A few gasps, a cough. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Nathan did not stand. He looked up at Bennett, really looked at him now, saw the lines around his eyes, the pride, the certainty, the quiet terror of losing control that lived beneath it all. "No," Nathan said. The word was soft, but it hit harder than shouting ever could. Bennett's face flushed. "That wasn't a request." "I know." Linda stepped forward again, her heart pounding. "Captain, please. We're already delayed. Let's just get airborne." Bennett shot her a look that could freeze steel. Enough. Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. He could feel the cabin watching him, judging him, measuring him against assumptions they didn't even know they were making. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, aware of how every movement could be misread. Bennett stiffened, one hand lifting instinctively. Nathan pulled out a small notebook, worn, leather. He opened it and wrote a single line, neat and precise. He capped the pen, looked up. "I'm not going to raise my voice," he said. "I'm not going to argue. But I'm not moving." Bennett's patience snapped. "Then you're forcing my hand." He turned sharply toward the galley. "Call ground security." The words echoed. Final. Irrevocable. Linda felt her stomach drop. Mark closed his eyes for half a second in the cockpit, a silent prayer that this would somehow end differently. It wouldn't. Nathan nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. He stood slowly, not in surrender, but in choice. The cabin seemed to shrink around him. "I'll walk," he said. "I won't give you a scene." As he stepped into the aisle, Bennett felt a surge of vindication. Order restored. Authority affirmed. He didn't notice the way Nathan's eyes swept the cabin one last time, taking in faces, reactions, small tells. He didn't notice Nathan slip a thick business card onto the empty seat, face down, careful, almost respectful. "Unbelievable," Bennett muttered as security approached from the jet bridge. "Some people just don't know when to comply." Nathan passed Linda on his way out. She met his eyes, shame flickering there. He gave her a small, understanding nod. Not forgiveness. Understanding. There was a difference. As the aircraft door closed behind him, the engines idled, waiting. The storm outside pressed closer. And Captain Harold Bennett, standing tall in the aisle of first class, had no idea that the man he had just dismissed was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. The jet bridge smelled like wet concrete and old rubber, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes whether you noticed it or not. Nathan Cole walked between two airport security officers, not restrained, not rushed, but very aware of the eyes following him through the glass. Passengers inside the terminal slowed their steps. Some pretended not to stare, others didn't bother. A middle-aged man being escorted off a plane always triggered assumptions. Drunk, angry, unstable. Nathan had learned long ago how quickly strangers wrote entire stories about you without asking a single question. "Sir, you can wait here," one of the officers said, gesturing toward a row of plastic chairs near a support pillar. His tone wasn't hostile, just procedural. Tired. It was early. Nathan nodded and sat. He placed his notebook on his knee, resting his palm over it like a habit, not a shield. His heart rate was steady. That surprised even him. Years ago, this would have set his nerves on fire. Today, it felt like gravity doing what gravity always did. Through the thick glass, he could see the aircraft. The noselight glowed pale in the rain. The ground crew moved with practiced choreography, orange vests cutting through grey. Inside that metal tube, Captain Harold Bennett was probably already back in his seat, telling himself a story that made him the hero. Nathan didn't need to hear it to know the words. Safety, authority, standards. He had read those words in reports for decades. One of the officers cleared his throat. "You want some water?" "Yes," Nathan said. "Thank you." As the officer walked away, Nathan leaned back and closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not to escape, to remember. He remembered his first job out of college, inspecting regional airfields in the Midwest. Old hangars, flickering lights, men who looked at him like he didn't belong in their world. He remembered learning early that anger never won you the room. Documentation did. Patience did. Letting people hang themselves with their own words did. His phone vibrated once in his pocket. He didn't rush to answer it. He waited until the vibration stopped, then pulled it out. A single missed call. FAA Operations Center. He exhaled through his nose and stood, dialing back. "This is Cole," he said quietly. The voice on the other end was all business. Female, calm, efficient. "We received your preliminary note. Can you confirm removal was initiated by the captain without a documented safety trigger?" "Yes," Nathan said. "No intoxication, no disruptive behavior, no refusal of crew instruction until the instruction itself violated policy." A pause. Keyboard clicks. "Understood. Stay where you are." Nathan ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, just as the officer returned with a paper cup. "Here you go." "Appreciate it," Nathan said, taking a small sip. Inside the aircraft, the mood had shifted. The door was closed, but the tension hadn't left with the passenger. It had stayed behind, soaked into the upholstery. Linda Morales moved down the aisle, her smile tight, her shoulders tense. She could feel the eyes on her, feel the unspoken question hovering in the air. Was that really necessary? She avoided answering it by adjusting a tray table that didn't need adjusting. In the cockpit, Bennett settled into his seat, the familiar creak of leather under his weight grounding him. He placed his hat on the side panel and adjusted his headset. This was the part he loved, the ritual, the machine responding to him. "Let's get clearance," he said, voice firm, clipped, back in command. Mark Ellison hesitated. He glanced at the closed cockpit door, then at the panel, then back at Bennett. "Ground's asking us to hold for a moment," he said. Bennett frowned. "For what?" They didn't say. Bennett tapped the armrest with 2 fingers, an old habit when he felt control slipping. "Fine, but let's not drag this out." Minutes passed. The rain intensified, drumming against the fuselage like impatient fingers. The cabin lights hummed softly. In first class, the woman in pearls leaned toward her husband. "That didn't sit right with me," she whispered. He nodded, eyes fixed forward. Neither of them said more. Linda paused near the cockpit door, debating with herself. She had seen a lot in her career. Fights, medical emergencies, drunks. This hadn't been any of those. This had been something colder, more calculated. She pressed the intercom button lightly. "Captain," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Ground's asking for an update. They say to remain at the gate." Bennett's jaw tightened. "We're ready. Tell them that." She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. He turned his head slowly. "Linda." She swallowed. "Yes, Captain," and stepped back. Outside, Nathan watched as a small cluster of people approached the aircraft. Not security this time. Suits, clipboards. One of them walked with a familiar posture, the kind that came from years of knowing exactly how much authority you carried without needing to display it. Nathan straightened, finishing his water. The airport duty manager stopped a few feet from him. "Mr. Cole?" "Yes. I'm told there's been a concern raised regarding crew conduct." Nathan met his eyes. "There has." The duty manager nodded once, already knowing this was bigger than a single flight. "We're going to need you to come with us." Nathan stood. Of course. They walked toward the aircraft together, footsteps echoing softly on the jet bridge. With every step, the air seemed to thicken, anticipation building like pressure in a sealed container. Nathan could feel the shift happening now. The point of no return had passed somewhere back in Seat 1C. Inside the cockpit, Bennett was mid-sentence, complaining about schedules and inefficiencies, when the door unlocked from the outside. The sound was subtle, but it cut through him like a warning bell. He turned just as the door opened. The duty manager stepped in first, face tight. Behind him, another man in a dark jacket with an FAA pin clipped to the lapel. And then, Nathan Cole. No jacket now, sleeves rolled just slightly. Calm, unhurried. For a split second, Bennett didn't recognize him. Then he did, and something inside his chest dropped. "This is a sterile cockpit," Bennett said automatically, the words coming out thinner than he intended. "Not at the moment," the man with the pin said. "Captain Bennett, you've been relieved of duty pending review." The words hung in the air, heavy, irreversible. Mark's breath caught. Linda froze in the doorway. The cabin went silent, as if the plane itself were listening. Bennett stood slowly, disbelief hardening into something darker. "On what grounds?" Nathan spoke then, his voice steady, controlled, carrying weight without volume. "On the grounds that authority without restraint is a risk to safety. And today, you demonstrated that risk." Bennett looked at him, really looked at him now, searching for something he could argue with, a flaw, a crack. There was none. "And who are you to decide that?" Bennett asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. Nathan reached into his pocket and held up his badge. Not dramatically, just enough. "Director of Flight Standards," he said. "Federal Aviation Administration." The cockpit felt suddenly too small, too exposed. Bennett's mouth opened, then closed. The machine he had commanded for decades now felt like a witness. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the balance of power shifted completely. The cabin didn't explode into noise. It collapsed inward instead. Conversations didn't resume. Phones didn't come out. The silence was thick, almost reverent, the kind that follows a verdict no one expected, but everyone understands. Captain Harold Bennett stood frozen beside his seat, one hand gripping the backrest, the other hanging uselessly at his side. His face had lost its color. Not panic yet. Something worse. Calculation failing in real time. Mark Ellison felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He had imagined many endings to this morning. Delays, angry passengers, a write-up. He had never imagined watching his captain lose command of the flight in front of him. His mouth was dry. He kept his hands visible, flat on his thighs, as if the airplane itself might accuse him next. "Yes, sir," Mark said automatically when the FAA official looked his way, though no one had asked him anything yet. Old habits clung hard. Nathan Cole stepped fully into the cockpit now. He didn't crowd Bennett. He didn't raise his voice. He positioned himself just far enough away to make it clear this was not a confrontation. It was an assessment. He glanced once at the overhead panel, at the neatly arranged checklists clipped beside the window, at the worn leather yoke polished by decades of use. A good cockpit, a disciplined one, which made what had happened harder to excuse, not easier. "Captain Bennett," Nathan said, using the name deliberately, "you're not being accused of incompetence. You're being evaluated for judgment." Bennett swallowed. "I exercised my authority," he said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I made a call to keep order in the cabin." Nathan nodded. "You exercised authority?" "Yes. But authority is not instinct. It's responsibility." Behind them, Linda Morales stood with one hand braced against the doorframe. She had never seen Bennett like this. Never seen anyone talk to him this way and survive the conversation. Her chest felt tight, a strange mix of dread and relief battling it out. She realized, with a quiet shock, that she had been waiting for someone like Nathan to show up for a long time. She just hadn't known it. The FAA official beside Nathan spoke next, voice firm, clipped. "Captain Bennett, per protocol, you are relieved of duty for this flight pending a formal review. You will not re-enter the cockpit." Bennett let out a short, humorless breath. "You're grounding me over a seating disagreement?" "No," Nathan said calmly. "Over a pattern." The word landed heavier than anything else. Pattern. Bennett's eyes flicked toward him, sharp now, defensive. "What pattern?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. He turned slightly, just enough to include Mark in his line of sight. "First Officer Ellison," he said, "did you observe any behavior from me that constituted a safety risk prior to my removal?" Mark's throat tightened. This was it. The line he had been afraid of crossing his entire career. He glanced at Bennett, then back at Nathan. His voice came out low but clear. "No, sir. You were calm, cooperative. You didn't raise your voice or refuse a lawful instruction until the instruction itself became questionable." Bennett snapped his head toward him. "Mark." Mark didn't look away. His hands were shaking now, but he didn't lower his eyes. "I documented that," he added quietly, "for my own record." For the first time, Bennett looked truly afraid. Not of Nathan, of what he was hearing himself reflected back through other people. He straightened his jacket, a reflexive gesture that fooled no one. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. "I've flown safely for nearly 4 decades. "And that matters," Nathan said. "It matters a great deal. Which is why it's being taken seriously." They stepped out of the cockpit together. The first-class cabin came into view like a theater audience caught mid-breath. Faces turned. Eyes tracked every movement. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Nathan felt the weight of the moment settle across the space. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about witness. The duty manager spoke quietly to Linda, instructing her to begin preparations for a crew change. She nodded, already moving, her professionalism snapping into place like armor. As she passed Bennett, their eyes met. For a second, she saw something raw there. Not rage, not arrogance. Loss. "I never meant for this to go this far," Bennett said under his breath. She hesitated, then said, "That's the problem, Captain," and walked on. Nathan addressed the cabin, his voice carrying without strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are changing flight crews to ensure this flight continues safely and in compliance with federal standards. We appreciate your cooperation." There was no apology in his tone. No need for one. A few passengers nodded. One older man near the aisle folded his newspaper, slowly, thoughtfully, as if reassessing something he had believed for a long time. Bennett was escorted toward the front exit. Not by force, by procedure. Each step felt heavier than the last. He kept his chin up, but his eyes flicked toward the windows, the seats, the symbols of a world that had always made sense to him until today. As he reached the jet bridge, he paused, turning slightly. "You set me up," he said quietly to Nathan. Nathan met his gaze. "No," he replied. "I gave you room to choose. You chose." Outside the plane, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. The jet bridge lights reflected off the wet floor in pale streaks. Bennett stopped just before the terminal door, shoulders sagging for the first time. "You think this makes things better?" he asked. "I think it makes them honest," Nathan said. Behind them, the aircraft sat motionless, doors open, waiting. Inside, Mark Ellison exhaled shakily as he slid into the left seat under supervision, the weight of it both terrifying and exhilarating. Linda moved through the cabin, her movements sure now, her voice steady as she reassured passengers. Something had shifted. Not just authority, perspective. Nathan stood at the threshold a moment longer, listening to the muted sounds of the airport waking up around him. He knew what came next. Reports, hearings, long days in conference rooms, explaining why moments like this mattered. He also knew that somewhere down the line, another man like Bennett would test the limits again. They always did. He turned and walked away, leaving the plane behind him, carrying with him the quiet certainty that today had changed more than just one flight. The investigation did not begin with sirens or headlines. It began with silence. The kind that lives in conference rooms with frosted glass and bad coffee. The kind that waits for facts. 3 hours after the flight finally departed with the replacement crew, Captain Harold Bennett sat alone in a windowless office at the airport operations building. His uniform jacket lay folded on the table in front of him, the 4 stripes still crisp, still authoritative, as if they didn't know they were about to become irrelevant. He stared at them anyway. 38 years of mornings that began before dawn. 38 years of believing the cockpit was the last place in America where order still meant something. A recorder sat between him and the wall, red light off, waiting. When the door opened, Bennett straightened out of habit. Nathan Cole walked in with 2 others. One was a legal advisor from the airline, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a legal pad already half full. The other was an FAA compliance officer Bennett didn't recognize. Younger, quiet, observant. Nathan didn't sit immediately. He placed a thin folder on the table directly in front of Bennett, then took the chair opposite him. He rested his hands flat, fingers spread slightly, like a man about to deliver news he had already made peace with. "This is not a trial," Nathan said. "It's a review. Your cooperation matters." Bennett nodded once. He had learned long ago when to conserve energy. "You want my statement?" "Yes." The recorder clicked on. Bennett spoke carefully. "About standards. About maintaining calm in premium cabins. About instincts sharpened over decades." He avoided words like race, avoided words like bias. He framed everything as professional judgment, as duty. He was good at this. He had testified before, safety boards, internal reviews. He knew how to sound reasonable. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Bennett finished, the room felt smaller. Nathan opened the folder and slid a single document forward. "This is not about today alone," he said. Today was the trigger. Bennett glanced down. It was a summary. Dates, flight numbers, passenger removal incidents. 12 entries over 5 years. Different routes, different aircraft. Same captain. "You see the common thread?" Nathan asked. Bennett didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the names. Some he remembered, some he didn't. "Those were judgment calls," he said finally. "Every one of them." "Yes," Nathan said. "They were." He leaned back slightly. And that's the problem. The compliance officer spoke for the first time. In each case, the passenger was later cleared of any disruptive behavior. No intoxication, no threats, no policy violations. The airline lawyer added, her voice precise. In 3 of those cases, the company paid quiet settlements. Bennett felt heat rise in his chest. You're building a narrative, he said. You're connecting dots that don't belong together. Nathan's expression didn't change. Patterns don't care whether we like them. Outside the room, the airport moved on. Flights departed. Luggage rolled. People complained about delays that felt personal to them and insignificant to everyone else. Inside, time slowed. Every word carried weight. What happens now? Bennett asked. Nathan closed the folder. Now the process does. The days that followed were methodical, deliberate. Bennett was placed on administrative leave pending review. His access badge deactivated. His flight bag returned to him without ceremony. The airline issued a neutral statement about crew reassignment and ongoing evaluation. No accusations, no defense, just distance. At home, Bennett sat in his kitchen, staring at the same table he had eaten breakfast at for 20 years. The walls felt closer. The house too quiet. His wife moved around him carefully, like someone navigating an injury they couldn't see. You did nothing illegal, she said more than once. I know, Bennett replied. But the words didn't bring comfort. Across town, Nathan sat in a different kind of quiet. His office overlooked a river, gray and steady, moving forward without opinion. He spent long hours reviewing transcripts, not just Bennett's, others, similar cases, different outcomes. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle deeper into his shoulders. This was never about one man. It never was. A week later, Bennett was called in for a formal hearing. This time it wasn't just the FAA. The airline's senior leadership was present. Union representation too, though their tone had shifted. Less combative, more resigned. The hearing room was larger, brighter, windows this time. Bennett sat at the long table, hands clasped, suit instead of uniform. He looked older without the stripes, smaller. Nathan entered last. He took a seat and waited for the room to settle. The airline's chief counsel spoke first. Captain Bennett, we've reviewed your record. Your technical performance has been exemplary. No safety violations, no procedural errors in flight operations. Bennett felt a flicker of hope. But, she continued, command authority is not limited to technical skill. It includes judgment under pressure and respect for federal compliance standards. Nathan stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The role of a captain carries enormous trust, he said. Not just from passengers, but from the system itself. When that trust is compromised, even subtly, the system responds. He didn't mention Nathan Cole in seat 1C. He didn't mention clothing. He didn't mention discomfort. He spoke instead about decision thresholds, about escalation, about the line between prevention and prejudice. The words were clinical, but the room felt heavy with meaning. Bennett listened. He wanted to interrupt, to argue, to point out that the world had changed faster than he had, that standards used to mean something simpler. He stayed silent. Somewhere deep inside, a quieter truth was beginning to surface, unwelcome and undeniable. When the decision came, it was delivered without drama. Bennett's airman certificate was revoked, not suspended. Revoked. The union declined arbitration. The airline terminated his employment with cause, citing violation of conduct standards. There would be no appeal. Bennett walked out of the building alone. Months later, the industry absorbed the lesson in quieter ways. New training modules appeared. Revised language around command authority circulated. Older captains grumbled. Younger ones paid attention. Linda Morales was asked to help design de-escalation training for cabin crews. Mark Ellison completed his upgrade training and took his first flight as captain, with hands that still shook just a little. Nathan watched it all from a distance. He knew change was slow, that resistance would always find new forms. He also knew that moments like that morning in the cabin mattered, even when they were uncomfortable, especially then. On a cold afternoon, Nathan boarded a flight home. He took a seat in the middle of the cabin this time. No jacket, no badge visible. Just another passenger. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, professional, respectful. Nathan closed his eyes briefly as the plane pushed back from the gate. The system moved forward, not because it was perfect, but because, sometimes, it was willing to correct itself. The fallout didn't stop at revocation. It spread outward, quiet at first, then relentless. Harold Bennett learned that reputation doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes. Phone calls stop getting returned. Emails are answered with templates. Invitations vanish without explanation. Men who once clapped him on the back at retirement dinners now pretended not to recognize him in grocery store aisles. He told himself this was temporary, a misunderstanding, a storm that would pass. He had survived worse turbulence than this. But turbulence ends. Gravity does not. 3 weeks after the hearing, a letter arrived by certified mail. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. The envelope was heavy, the paper inside thicker than it needed to be. Bennett sat at the kitchen table, reading slowly, lips moving without sound. The words were careful, measured. They accused nothing outright. They asked questions. They requested documents. They referenced federal statutes he hadn't thought about since training decades earlier. His wife stood behind him, one hand resting on the back of the chair. "What does it mean?" she asked. Bennett folded the letter with surgical precision. "It means they're looking," he said. "And once they look, they don't stop." Across the country, Nathan Cole stood in a very different room. A boardroom high above downtown, glass walls overlooking a city that never slowed for personal crises. The executives seated around the table were older, seasoned, careful men and women who had spent their lives navigating risk. This wasn't their first scandal. But it was the first that made them uneasy in a way spreadsheets couldn't explain. The CEO sat at the head of the table. Margaret Klein, early 60s, former prosecutor. Eyes that missed nothing. She didn't fidget. She didn't rush. She waited until everyone had finished speaking, then leaned forward just slightly. "This isn't about one captain," she said. "It's about what we tolerated without noticing." She turned to Nathan. "Tell them." Nathan didn't stand. He didn't posture. He simply spoke. He talked about patterns again, about how authority, when unchecked, always finds a target, about how systems fail not when bad people act, but when good people look away because it's easier. He referenced data, passenger complaints, quiet settlements, training gaps that had been flagged and ignored because addressing them felt uncomfortable. No one interrupted him. When he finished, the room stayed silent. The city moved beyond the glass, unaware. Margaret Klein broke the silence. "We cooperate fully," she said, "with the DOJ, with the FAA, with anyone who asks." One executive shifted uncomfortably. "That could expose us." She met his eyes. "We're already exposed. The question is whether we learn or pretend we didn't see the fire until it reached the walls." The story broke a week later. Not with outrage, with documentation. An investigative piece that laid out timelines, numbers, internal memos. No adjectives, no speculation. Just facts, stacked carefully until denial became impossible. The headline didn't mention Bennett's name. It didn't need to. The comments did that for them. Bennett watched the coverage from his living room, remote loose in his hand. He recognized himself in the footage, Not the man he believed he was, but the man others saw. Rigid, dismissive, certain. He felt something crack then. Not his pride, something deeper. The belief that intention mattered more than impact. The knock at the door came just after noon. 2 agents, polite, professional. They asked if he would answer a few questions. He said yes, because saying no felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to face. They sat at his table, asked about procedures, about decision-making, about the times he had felt compelled to remove passengers. "Did you consider alternatives?" one agent asked. Bennett hesitated. The pause was long enough to be noticed. "I believed I was preventing escalation," he said. "And did escalation occur in those instances?" "No." "So what were you preventing?" Bennett didn't answer. In another city, Mark Ellison stood in front of a classroom of pilots, his palms damp despite the steady tone of his voice. He talked about judgment, about moments when silence felt safer than honesty. He didn't mention Bennett by name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew the story. He saw older captains in the back row shifting in their seats, arms crossed, faces guarded. He also saw younger pilots leaning forward, listening. Linda Morales sat in on those sessions sometimes. She spoke less about policy and more about moments. The look in a passenger's eyes when they realize they've already been judged. The way a cabin changes when authority hardens instead of listening. Her voice carried weight because it came from experience, not theory. Nathan watched these changes from the margins, aware that progress never announced itself loudly. He declined interviews. He redirected praise. This wasn't about him. It never had been. The system didn't need heroes. It needed accountability. The DOJ findings came quietly. No dramatic press conference, no handcuffs, just conclusions. Discriminatory impact established. Pattern confirmed. Civil penalties assessed. Mandatory reforms imposed. Bennett's name appeared in the report, once, without commentary. He read it alone in his study, the words blurring as realization finally took root. He hadn't been unlucky. He hadn't been targeted. He had been revealed. Months later, Bennett took a job driving a shuttle between long-term parking and the terminal. Early mornings, late nights. Passengers who didn't look at his face when they spoke. It was honest work, humbling in ways he hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, a man in a suit tossed a bag into the back and said, "Careful with that." Bennett nodded and adjusted the strap, muscles aching. As he climbed back into the driver's seat, he caught his reflection in the mirror. No stripes, no authority. Just a man responsible for getting others safely from one place to another. The thought landed heavier than he expected. That same day, Nathan boarded a flight in another city. Coach seat. Window. He watched the ground fall away as the plane climbed, steady and smooth. The captain's voice came over the intercom, clear and unhurried, speaking not from dominance, but from duty. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. Not in relief, in resolve. Because the work wasn't done. It never would be. Systems drift. Power tempts. People forget. And somewhere, on another flight, another decision was being made that would test whether the lesson held. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign chimed, and life went on, carrying forward the quiet, fragile hope that this time, someone would choose better. The story didn't end with headlines or courtrooms. It moved into something quieter, more dangerous. Normalization. That was how systems protected themselves when the shock wore off. 6 months after the incident, the industry had absorbed the lesson just enough to stop talking about it out loud. Training modules were completed. Policies were updated. Statements were archived. And yet, beneath the surface, the old instincts waited patiently for another chance. Nathan Cole felt it during a flight out of Phoenix, seated halfway down the cabin, watching how people behaved when they thought no one important was listening. A gate agent lowered her voice when a passenger challenged an upgrade. A flight attendant stiffened when a man in work boots asked for help stowing his bag. None of it crossed a line. That was the point. It hovered just beneath one. The space where bias learned how to hide. Across the country, Harold Bennett woke before dawn every day without an alarm. His body hadn't forgotten the rhythm of duty, even if duty had forgotten him. He pulled on the same faded jacket, laced the same scuffed shoes, and drove the shuttle route he could now navigate with his eyes closed. Terminal to parking, parking to terminal, back and forth. Faces changed, conversations repeated. He listened more than he spoke. It was the only way to survive the long hours without drowning in memory. He didn't tell anyone who he used to be. Some passengers recognized him anyway, not by name, by posture, by the way he checked mirrors, by the way he watched the sky during idle moments like he was still measuring wind and distance. Once a younger pilot climbed aboard, uniform crisp, flight bag rolling behind him. Their eyes met in the mirror. Recognition flickered, then passed. The pilot nodded politely and looked away. That hurt more than anger would have. Nathan's work shifted into a new phase. Less reaction, more anticipation. He was invited into rooms where decisions were framed before they became problems. Advisory councils, quiet briefings, conversations that never made it into press releases. He learned which executives listened and which merely waited their turn to speak. He learned how often discomfort masqueraded as tradition. One afternoon, a report crossed his desk that made him pause. Not dramatic, not illegal. Just a series of small, documented complaints clustered around a single hub. No removals, no security calls. Just passengers consistently describing the same feeling. Being singled out, being managed differently, being made to feel like guests who had overstayed their welcome. Nathan read the report twice, then a third time. Patterns were never loud. They whispered. He flew to the city unannounced. The airport was busy. Controlled chaos. Nathan moved through it unnoticed, exactly as he intended. He sat in different terminals, watched interactions, took notes that looked like travel scribbles to anyone glancing over his shoulder. He saw a supervisor redirect a complaint with practiced empathy that resolved nothing. He saw a manager explain policy with a smile that left no room for questions. Everything was technically correct. That was what made it dangerous. The meeting with local leadership took place late in the afternoon. Glass walls, neutral tones, bottled water untouched. Nathan didn't accuse. He asked. He listened. He let them talk themselves into corners they didn't realize they were entering. When one executive finally said, "We can't accommodate everyone," Nathan nodded slowly. "No," he replied, "but you can treat everyone the same." That night, he sat alone in a hotel room, lights off, city glowing below. He thought about Bennett, about how rarely systems failed because of villains. They failed because of people who believed their experience exempted them from reflection. People who had done the job long enough to confuse familiarity with wisdom. He understood the temptation. Authority felt good. It simplified the world. It told you that your instincts were earned, not assumed. The next morning, a call came in from Washington. A proposal had reached the final stage. A structural change. Not a policy memo, not another training video. Something deeper. Nathan listened without interrupting. When the call ended, he sat very still for a long moment. This would change things. It would also make enemies. Weeks later, the announcement went out. Quiet. Technical language. Easily missed by anyone not paying attention. A new oversight mechanism embedded directly into operational review. Independent, rotational, unpredictable. It removed the comfort of knowing when scrutiny was coming. It shifted the balance from reactive to constant accountability. Some welcomed it. Others bristled. Harold Bennett heard about it on the radio during a slow afternoon shift. A brief segment, no names, no drama. Just a summary of changes aimed at reinforcing fairness and judgment in command authority. He pulled the shuttle over after dropping off a passenger and sat there longer than necessary, engine idling, rain tapping lightly against the windshield. For the first time in months, he didn't feel singled out. He felt understood. Not forgiven. Understood. That evening he sat at his kitchen table and opened a notebook he hadn't touched since the hearing. He wrote slowly, not defensively, honestly, about moments he had misread, about assumptions he had never examined because they had always worked in his favor. It wasn't an apology. It was an inventory, and it was harder than any simulator check he had ever failed. On another flight, somewhere over the plains, Nathan listened to a captain address the cabin. The tone was different. Less command, more care. It wasn't dramatic. Most passengers wouldn't notice. Nathan did. He watched the crew move with a confidence that didn't rely on intimidation. He felt something loosen in his chest. Not satisfaction. Vigilance doesn't allow that. But possibility. The system hadn't been fixed. It never would be. But it had been nudged, redirected, forced to look at itself without flinching. That was enough for now. As the plane descended, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the land below. Nathan closed his notebook and tucked it away. Somewhere behind him, a conversation rose and fell. Somewhere ahead, another decision waited to be made. The work continued, not in grand gestures, but in moments where someone chose restraint over reflex, responsibility over comfort. And that, Nathan knew, was where real change lived. The call came at dusk, when the day had already decided how it would end. Nathan Cole stood at the window of his office, watching the river darken, the city lights waking one by one. He almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Then he answered. Yes. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled, carrying the strain of someone who had already been arguing with too many people for too many hours. We've got a situation. Denver hub, domestic flight. Captain is refusing to delay departure despite a crew report. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. Refusing on what grounds? Claims the report is subjective. Says he's within his authority. Nathan turned away from the window. The glass reflected his face back at him, older than it used to be, harder around the eyes. Has the report been logged? Yes, twice. Then he's not refusing a delay, Nathan said. He's challenging oversight. Silence. Then, we need you. Nathan didn't ask why. He didn't ask what airline. He didn't ask the captain's name. He already knew how this story usually began. I'm on the next flight, he said, and ended the call. At the Denver terminal, snow was starting to fall. Heavy flakes, the kind that softened sound and sharpened nerves. Nathan moved through the crowd unnoticed, coat collar turned up, hat low. He could feel it again, that old pressure in his chest. Not fear, anticipation. This was the moment where theory met metal. The flight was still boarding when he reached the gate. He stood back, watching. A flight attendant leaned in toward a supervisor, speaking quickly, hands tight at her sides. The supervisor nodded, jaw clenched. No smiles, no casual chatter. Nathan checked his watch. The clock mattered here. Inside the aircraft, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm, confident, almost soothing. Ladies and gentlemen, we're finishing final checks and we'll be pushing back shortly. Nathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He stepped forward. I need to speak with the duty manager, he said to the gate agent. The agent looked up, irritation flashing across her face before training took over. Sir, boarding is almost complete. Nathan met her eyes. This cannot wait. Something in his tone made her hesitate. She picked up the phone. Minutes later, Nathan stood at the aircraft door again, this time with company. The duty manager's face was pale. The supervisor avoided eye contact. The jet bridge creaked softly as the wind picked up outside. The door opened. The cockpit was sealed, but not silent. Raised voices leaked through the door, one of them sharp, defensive. Nathan recognized that tone instantly. It was the sound of authority being questioned and not liking it. When the door opened, the captain turned in his seat, irritation already set. He was younger than Bennett had been, early 50s, strong build, confident posture. The kind of man who still believed his instincts were enough. "This is a sterile cockpit," the captain said, irritation edging his voice. "Who authorized this?" Nathan stepped forward. "I did." The captain stared at him, assessing, measuring. "And you are?" "Nathan Cole." The name landed with a dull thud. Recognition flickered. Not fear yet. Calculation. "I'm within my authority," the captain said quickly. "There's no mechanical issue, no weather restriction. This delay is unnecessary." Nathan nodded once. "The issue isn't mechanical." "Then it's not my problem." Nathan felt the moment stretch. This was the fork in the road. The place where everything could still turn. "Your crew reported escalating tension in the cabin," Nathan said. "That makes it your problem." The captain scoffed. "Crew reports tension all the time. If we delayed for every feeling, we'd never fly." Nathan leaned in slightly. Not aggressive, intent. "And if you ignore every warning sign, eventually you fly once too often." Silence. Thick. Charged. Behind Nathan, the duty manager shifted his weight. He had seen this before, knew how it usually ended. The captain asserting, the system bending. Today felt different. "I'm not grounding this aircraft," the captain said. "You don't have that authority." Nathan met his gaze steadily. "I don't need it." He gestured slightly, and the FAA compliance officer beside him stepped forward, tablet already lit. "Captain," the officer said, "per active oversight protocol, your refusal to acknowledge a documented safety concern constitutes grounds for immediate operational review." The captain's face tightened. "You're overreaching." Nathan's voice stayed calm. "You're underestimating." The cabin lights flickered as ground power shifted. Somewhere behind them, a passenger laughed nervously, the sound cutting short when no one joined in. The aircraft felt like it was holding its breath. "Captain," Nathan said, quieter now, "this is the moment. You can pause, or you can force us to stop you." The captain's jaw worked. Pride and caution wrestled behind his eyes. For a long second, Nathan thought of Bennett, of the line between experience and entitlement, of how thin it really was. Finally, the captain exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said. "We delay." The word didn't sound like surrender. It sounded like resentment. Nathan nodded. "Thank you." As they stepped back into the jet bridge, the duty manager let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That could have gone badly. "It still might," Nathan said. The flight eventually departed. Late, uneasy, but intact. No headlines, no videos, no fallout. Just a quiet correction, invisible to most. Nathan watched the plane taxi from the terminal window, its lights cutting through falling snow. This was the work now. Not dramatic removals, not public reckonings. This. Standing in the narrow space between authority and accountability. Forcing choices before mistakes hardened into disasters. Nathan turned away as the aircraft lifted into the grey sky. Somewhere inside, a captain was replaying the moment over and over, telling himself a story that made sense. Nathan hoped, this time, the story would end differently. Because the system didn't change in moments of collapse. It changed in moments like this. When someone paused. When someone listened. When power chose restraint, not because it was forced, but because it finally understood the cost of not doing so. The hearing room in Washington did not look like a place where lives changed. It looked like a place designed to prevent drama. Neutral walls, fluorescent lights, a long table scarred by years of elbows and coffee cups. Nathan Cole preferred it that way. Drama distracted from truth. This room had no patience for distraction. He arrived early, as he always did, not to claim territory, but to listen to the room before people filled it. He set his notebook down, opened it, then closed it again. Today wasn't about notes. Today was about alignment. Systems correcting themselves rarely did so cleanly. There was always friction, always resistance disguised as reason. When the room filled, it filled quietly. Airline representatives, union observers, legal counsel. No press, no cameras. This wasn't about optics. This was about precedent. Across the table sat the Denver captain from weeks earlier, Thomas Keller, 52, broad shoulders that still carried confidence, though it had softened at the edges. He looked older than he had on the jet bridge, not physically, in the eyes. He nodded once when Nathan entered, not respectful, acknowledging. That mattered. The chair at the head of the table called the session to order. The language was procedural, almost dull. Timeline, crew report, captain response, oversight intervention, outcome. Each item was presented without commentary. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. When Keller was asked to speak, he did so carefully. He talked about pressure, schedules, passenger expectations, about how delaying flights felt like surrendering control in a profession built on decisiveness. He didn't deny what he had done. He contextualized it. That was progress, even if he didn't see it yet. Nathan listened without interrupting. He watched Keller's hands, the way they clenched when authority was mentioned, the way they relaxed when responsibility was reframed. This was not an enemy. This was a mirror, one the industry needed to keep looking into. When it was Nathan's turn, he stood, but he didn't command attention. He waited for it to settle on him naturally. This review isn't about punishment, he said. It's about clarity. Authority exists to manage risk, not to dismiss it. When those two become confused, we don't get stronger. We get blind. A union representative shifted in his chair. Pilots are being second-guessed more than ever, he said. That erodes confidence. Nathan nodded. Unchecked confidence erodes safety faster. The room went still. He continued, measured. Experience matters. Seniority matters. But neither replaces judgment. And judgment doesn't come from instinct alone. It comes from listening. Especially when what you're hearing makes you uncomfortable. No one argued that point. They couldn't. The data didn't allow it. The session ended without fireworks. Keller's record reflected the intervention. Mandatory retraining. No suspension. No headlines. He would fly again. Changed or not would be his choice. The system had done its part. It had offered correction without destruction. That was the balance Nathan fought for. Outside, Washington moved at its own pace. Tourists drifted past monuments. Office workers argued about lunch. The machinery of government hummed quietly beneath it all. Nathan walked a few blocks instead of taking a car, needing the air. The city always reminded him that institutions were made of people, not stone. His phone rang as he crossed a side street. Linda Morales. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. The new de-escalation protocols just went live fleet-wide. Nathan smiled faintly. How are crews taking it? A mix, she said. Some grumbling, some relief, a lot of quiet attention. That's usually the good kind. They talked briefly about training sessions, about younger attendants asking questions veterans never had, about captains who listened more now, even if they pretended they didn't. When the call ended, Nathan felt something close to satisfaction. Not comfort. Satisfaction was earned. Comfort made you careless. That evening he flew home. Middle seat, economy. The plane was half full. A young mother struggled with an overhead bag. A flight attendant stepped in quickly, smiling, efficient. No tension, no edge, just competence. As the plane leveled off, the captain's voice came over the intercom. He introduced himself by first name only, thanked the crew. Acknowledged the delay without defensiveness. We appreciate your patience, he said. It helps us do our job right. Nathan leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of Bennett, of Keller, of the thin line every captain walked, whether they admitted it or not. He thought of how easily authority could become armor, and how heavy that armor grew over time. Weeks passed, then months. The oversight mechanism Nathan had helped implement began to change behavior in subtle ways. Reports were filed earlier, conversations happened sooner, escalations softened before they hardened. There were still incidents, there always would be, but fewer spiraled. Fewer ended in humiliation or removal. The system was learning to breathe. One afternoon, a handwritten letter arrived at Nathan's office. No return address. The handwriting was neat but stiff, like someone unaccustomed to writing by hand anymore. It was from Harold Bennett. He didn't apologize, not directly. He wrote about driving the shuttle at dawn, about watching planes lift into the sky and feeling something like grief mixed with relief. About understanding, finally, that his instincts had been shaped in a different era, and that refusing to examine them hadn't preserved order. It had endangered it. I thought authority was something you defended, the letter ended. I see now, it's something you earn every day. Nathan folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He didn't frame it, didn't respond. Some things didn't require replies. They required acknowledgement. On another flight, weeks later, turbulence rattled the cabin unexpectedly. The seatbelt sign chimed. A few passengers gasped. The captain's voice came on quickly, calm, reassuring, explaining exactly what was happening and why. Not commanding, informing. Nathan watched the crew move through the aisle, checking on passengers, making eye contact, steadying nerves. The plane rode it out, the sky smoothed. Conversations resumed. As they descended, Nathan looked out the window at the lights below, scattered like constellations. Each one a life, a decision, a moment of trust placed in someone else's hands. This was the work. Not the dramatic confrontations, not the public reckonings. The quiet recalibration of power. The willingness to pause, to listen, to choose responsibility over reflex. The plane touched down smoothly. Applause broke out in a few rows. The captain thanked everyone for flying with them. Nathan stood with the rest, collecting his bag, blending back into the flow of people moving forward. The system wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was paying attention now. And that, Nathan knew, was how real change began. The call came on a Sunday morning, the kind that pretends to be quiet until it isn't. Nathan Cole was making coffee, standing barefoot on the kitchen tile, when his phone vibrated against the counter. He looked at the screen longer than necessary. Unknown number. Washington area code. He answered without saying his name. "We've got a problem," the voice said. Older, controlled, familiar in the way authority always was. And this time, it's not a captain. Nathan closed his eyes once, just once. Tell me. It's executive level, the voice continued. Major carrier. Internal audit buried for years. We only caught it because your new oversight trigger flagged an anomaly. Nathan leaned against the counter. The coffee machine hissed, filling the space with steam and noise. What kind of anomaly? A pattern of protected removals, the voice said. Not passengers. Employees. Pilots and cabin crew quietly sidelined after raising concerns. Performance reviews rewritten. Medical referrals weaponized. Nathan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. This was different. Harder. Pilots could be grounded. Captains could be relieved. But when the rot lived above the flight deck, it didn't crash loudly. It suffocated slowly. Who signed off? There was a pause. The CEO. Nathan opened his eyes. 2 days later, he was walking into a building designed to intimidate. Glass and steel. 40 floors of reflected sky. The kind of headquarters that told you, before you ever spoke, that power lived here. He checked in without giving his title. He didn't need to. They already knew. The boardroom was quiet when he entered. Not tense. Curated. Bottled water placed at even intervals. Leather chairs pulled back just enough to suggest openness. At the far end of the table sat Eleanor Grant, 65, silver hair pulled tight, posture perfect. She had built the airline from a regional carrier into a global brand. Awards lined the wall behind her. Safety, innovation, leadership. She stood as Nathan approached. "Mr. Cole," she said warmly, "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I," Nathan replied. They sat. Lawyers flanked her. Advisors took notes. No one smiled now. The warmth was gone. This wasn't a courtesy call. This was a reckoning disguised as conversation. Eleanor spoke first. "I've reviewed the preliminary findings," she said. "I'm troubled, but I'm also confused. These decisions were made to protect operational stability." Nathan nodded slowly. "By silencing people who raised concerns?" "By managing disruption," she said. "You know how sensitive this industry is. One rumor can cost millions." Nathan leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. The gesture was small. The effect wasn't. "Stability built on fear isn't stability," he said. "It's liability." The lawyers shifted. One opened his mouth, then closed it again. Nathan slid a thin folder across the table. Eleanor didn't open it right away. She didn't have to. She already knew what was inside. "These aren't isolated incidents," Nathan continued. "They're coordinated. And they violate federal whistleblower protections." Eleanor finally opened the folder. Her eyes moved quickly. Efficient. Ruthless. For the first time, something flickered behind her composure. Not guilt. Calculation. "You're accusing me," she said carefully. "I'm informing you," Nathan replied, "before someone else does it publicly." Silence settled over the room. Heavy. Unforgiving. Eleanor closed the folder. "What do you want?" Nathan held her gaze. "Change," he said. "Real change. Or this moves out of this room." She leaned back, folding her hands. "And if I refuse?" Nathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Then the system does what it's designed to do. Outside the building, traffic moved. People hurried to lunch. Life continued, unaware that an empire was balancing on a decision made behind tinted glass. Hours later, Eleanor stood alone in the boardroom, staring out at the city she had helped conquer. Her phone buzzed. Another message. Another confirmation. The board had seen the data. The lawyers had stopped arguing. This wasn't about protecting the company anymore. It was about surviving it. That night, a brief statement went out, carefully worded. Leadership transition, internal review, commitment to transparency. The markets dipped, then steadied. The story didn't explode, it spread. In the weeks that followed, employees began to speak. Not all at once, not loudly, but steadily. Reports filed, records corrected, careers restored where possible. Not justice, accountability. There was a difference. Nathan watched it unfold from a distance. He didn't attend the press conference. He didn't give interviews. He knew this phase was fragile. Too much noise would turn it into spectacle. Too little would let it fade. One evening, he sat on a flight, watching the sun bleed into the horizon, the cabin bathed in amber light. A flight attendant stopped beside him, checking seatbelts. She met his eyes and hesitated. Recognition flickered. Gratitude, fear, hope, all of it. She moved on without a word. Nathan exhaled slowly. The system was learning, but learning hurt. It always did. Somewhere far above the clouds, a decision had been made that would never make a headline, but would ripple through the industry for years. A line had been drawn, not in ink, in consequence. And for the first time in a long while, Nathan felt something close to resolve settle into his bones. Not victory, not satisfaction. Resolve. Because this wasn't about one flight, or one captain, or one CEO. It was about whether power could finally learn to answer to something other than itself. The snow had melted by the time Nathan Cole stood on the observation deck overlooking the runway, but the air still carried that late winter bite that crept through wool and settled in the bones. Aircraft rolled past below him, engines humming, lights blinking in patient rhythm. Order restored. On the surface, at least. He watched one plane lift cleanly into the sky, nose rising with quiet confidence, and felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Not pride. Responsibility. The kind that never left, even when the work was done. The announcement had gone out 3 days earlier, buried beneath market reports and election chatter. A leadership transition. A federal compliance agreement. Mandatory restructuring. Dry words for a seismic shift. Eleanor Grant was gone. Quietly, without ceremony. No perp walk, no spectacle. Her resignation letter thanked employees for decades of service and spoke about stewardship, legacy, the future. It didn't mention fear, or silence, or the lives quietly rerouted to protect a balance sheet. It didn't have to. The record spoke now. Nathan's phone buzzed once in his pocket. He didn't check it right away. He knew what it would be. Confirmation. The final signature. The door closing behind an era that believed accountability was optional, as long as profits stayed high. He had learned that change rarely announced itself with fireworks. It arrived like this instead. Cold air, clean lines, a system adjusting its center of gravity. Behind him, footsteps approached, familiar ones. Linda Morales stopped a few feet away, hands tucked into her coat sleeves, eyes following the same plane. She looked different these days, lighter, not because the job had become easier, but because it finally felt honest. They just finished the briefing downstairs, she said quietly. People were actually listening. Nathan nodded. They usually do, when it's too late to pretend they didn't hear. She smiled faintly. I used to think that meant we'd failed. She paused. Now I think it means we finally said it clearly enough. They stood there in silence for a moment, watching ground crews scatter like pieces in a precise machine. Somewhere below, a captain raised a hand, signaling readiness. Somewhere else, a checklist was read carefully, not rushed, not skipped. Nathan felt a subtle shift inside him. This was what progress looked like. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just fewer shortcuts taken in moments no one would ever film. Across the country, Harold Bennett sat on a wooden bench near a bus depot, thermos between his feet, watching commuters hurry past. He no longer wore his old jacket. It hung in the back of his closet, untouched, stripes still intact, relics of a self he barely recognized anymore. The shuttle job had become routine, predictable, honest. He learned the rhythms of the city the way he once learned airspace, traffic patterns, human impatience, small kindnesses that appeared without warning. A young man boarded the bus, earbuds in, hoodie pulled tight against the wind. He struggled with a duffel bag, bumping it against the steps. Bennett stood and took the weight without thinking. "Careful," the kid muttered automatically, then stopped, looked up. "Thanks." Bennett nodded, setting the bag down securely. No authority in the gesture, just responsibility. That night, Bennett opened his notebook again, the one he had started after everything fell apart. The pages were no longer angry. They were observational. He wrote about moments he noticed now, about how often he had mistaken silence for agreement, about how easy it was to believe experience made you right, when it really just made you comfortable. He didn't know who he was writing for anymore. Maybe himself. Maybe the version of him that had once believed the sky owed him obedience. Back at the airport, Nathan descended the stairs and walked through the terminal without stopping. He blended easily into the flow, another traveler with a carry-on and a neutral expression. No one pointed, no one whispered. That was as it should be. Power that needed recognition had already lost its way. At the gate, a delay was announced. Minor. Weather further west. Groans rippled through the waiting area. Nathan took a seat and watched reactions. A businessman scowled. An older woman sighed and pulled out a paperback. A flight attendant knelt to reassure a nervous child. No raised voices, no sharp edges, just inconvenience, handled with restraint. Nathan made a small note in his head. This was also progress. When boarding began, he stepped onto the aircraft and felt the familiar shift as the cabining closed around him. The scent of recycled air, the muted clatter of bags, the low murmur of people settling into shared vulnerability. He took his seat by the aisle, economy as always. Across from him, a man with silver hair studied the safety card intently, as if it mattered. It did. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, measured, no theatrics. He introduced the crew by first name, thanked them, thanked the passengers too, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement. Nathan closed his eyes briefly as the plane pushed back, the vibration traveling up through the floor and into his legs. He remembered the first time he'd ever sat in a cockpit, decades ago, hands trembling with awe. He remembered thinking that control was everything. It had taken years to understand that restraint mattered more. As the aircraft climbed, sunlight broke through a layer of cloud, flooding the cabin in white. People blinked. A few smiled. Nathan felt the moment settle around him, quiet and complete. The system hadn't been fixed. It never would be. But it had learned, at least for now, to listen before damage became destiny. Below them, cities shrank into patterns, roads like veins, lights like scattered stars, lives intersecting briefly in metal tubes, hurtling through shared air, every one of them trusting strangers they would never meet to make the right calls when it counted. Nathan felt that trust like a weight and a privilege. He carried it without complaint. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, the cabin exhaled. Conversations resumed. A flight attendant passed, making eye contact, nodding slightly. Not recognition. Respect. Nathan returned it and looked out the window again. Somewhere down there, decisions were already being made that would test everything they had changed. That was the nature of systems. They drifted. They needed correction. Again and again. The plane leveled off, steady and sure. Nathan leaned back and let himself rest for the first time in days. Not because the work was over, but because it had moved forward. Quietly, relentlessly, human by human, authority by authority, choice by choice. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real about power, responsibility, and the cost of silence, show your support with a like, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with 3 words that say it best.